and welcome history enthusiasts. Today, we drift back into the fascinating world of medieval England to explore the life and reign of one of its greatest monarchs, King Edward III. From battles that shaped Europe to the culture, diplomacy, and legacy that defined his kingdom, we and Apostle will uncover what it truly meant to be England and Apost's legendary king. Before we begin, Don and Apost forget to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible journeys through the past. Let an Apost dive into the story of Edward III, and imagine waking up in a castle so enormous and so intricately designed that it feels like a city unto itself. The stone walls rise higher than the eye can see, battlements catching the early sunlight, banners fluttering in the wind, each emblazoned with the proud coat of arms of the king and his lineage. The air is crisp and cold, tinged with the smell of smoke from the hearths and the faint scent of livestock carried in from the stables. Outside, the castle courtyard buzzes with activity. Servants hurry to their chores, merchants haggle over goods in nearby market stalls, and soldiers practice their drills, the clatter of steel and the rhythm of hooves echoing against stone walls. Life in a medieval castle is a constant ballet of power, ritual, and routine, and for King Edward III, this was his world, though not a world of ease. To be king in 14th century England was to inhabit a position of unparalleled prestige, yes, but also one of extraordinary pressure and responsibility, a life in which every choice could have consequences of life or death for yourself and for millions of your subjects. Edward III ascended the throne in 1327, when he was only 14 years old, following the dramatic abdication of his father, Edward II. The story of Edward II and Apost's downfall is a tale of political intrigue, betrayal, and personal failure, and it set the stage for the young king and Apost's own journey. Edward II had been a weak and often unpopular monarch, accused of favoring certain courtiers, neglecting the demands of governance, and mishandling relations with the nobility. His personal relationships, especially those perceived as inappropriate or overly influential, sparked tension and rebellion across the kingdom. By the time Edward III inherited the crown, the kingdom was fraught with tension. Factions within the nobility vied for power, the common people bore the weight of heavy taxation and frequent conflict, and the memory of his father and Apost's failures loomed over him like a dark shadow. Imagine being 14, barely beyond childhood, and suddenly being expected to step into this world and carry not only the crown but the expectations, fears, and hopes of an entire nation. In the early years of his reign, Edward III was not entirely in control. His mother, Queen Isabella, and her ally and lover, Roger Mortimer, effectively ruled the kingdom as regents. This period must have felt suffocating for the young king. Every decision he made, every movement he took, was under scrutiny not just by his mother and Mortimer, but by a court full of nobles whose loyalty was uncertain. Edward had to navigate a complex web of alliances, secret plotting, and political maneuvering at an age when most boys are concerned with games and learning their letters. Yet even as a teenager, he demonstrated remarkable intelligence, ambition, and courage. The seeds of what would become a legendary reign were already visible in the way he observed, calculated, and learned from the adults around him. Life inside the castle was a mixture of ceremony, education, and constant vigilance. The day of a young king began at dawn, with the first light filtering through the narrow high windows of his chamber. Servants would enter to prepare him, dressing him in layers of fine fabrics suited for the weather and occasion, robes embroidered with the symbols of his house, tunics lined with fur for warmth. Meals were a formal affair, with tables laden with bread, meat, cheese, and ale, though these feasts were as much about display as sustenance. Every gesture, every word, every glance was observed. To be king was to live in a constant performance of authority and poise, even at the age of 14. Education was another vital part of the young king and Apost's life. Edward III was tutored in a range of subjects designed to prepare him for leadership. He learned Latin, the language of diplomacy and the church, as well as the history of England and its neighbors, the intricate laws of the realm, and the skills of governance. Beyond academics, he was trained in the art of combat, horsemanship, and military strategy lessons that would prove crucial in the years to come. Imagine the exhaustion and the pressure of balancing these demands. The mental rigor of studying treaties and history, the physical strain of practicing swordplay and riding, and the ever-present knowledge that the fate of the kingdom rested on his shoulders. But it was not only formal lessons that shaped Edward. The very atmosphere of the court taught him about power, loyalty, and betrayal. Nobles whispered in corridors, plotting alliances and rivalries. Advisors, some sincere, some self-serving, offered guidance that could shape the course of the kingdom. Every feast, every procession, every council meeting was a subtle lesson in the art of observation and judgment. The young king had to learn quickly whom to trust, whom to watch, and when to act. These early experiences instilled in Edward a keen understanding of human nature and the delicate balance required to maintain authority. Despite the rigid formality of life in the castle, Edward III in a post-world was also one of extraordinary sensory experience. The castle itself was a marvel of medieval architecture. Great stone halls, soaring ceilings, tapestries depicting battles and legends, and chapels adorned with intricate carvings and stained glass. The sound of bells announcing the hours, rituals, or approaching visitors filled the air. The smell of burning torches, roasting meat and fresh hay from the stables mixed in complex layers. Servants, guards, and animals created a constant hum of activity. For a young king, every day was a mixture of awe and responsibility, a life that combined wonder with unrelenting demands. At the same time, Edward III was acutely aware of the fragility of his position. The memory of his father and a post's missteps and eventual overthrow was a cautionary tale. Edward II at a post's weakness had invited rebellion, and Edward III understood that a king who appeared indecisive or timid could quickly be removed. This knowledge likely instilled both fear and determination. From an early age, Edward learned that being king was not just about enjoying privileges, it was about asserting authority, making decisive choices, and projecting strength, even when uncertainty loomed. The young king also witnessed the harsh realities of medieval life outside the castle walls. England in the 14th century was a kingdom of contrasts. While the nobility enjoyed relative comfort and grandeur, the common people faced heavy taxation, harsh labor, and the threat of famine or disease. Soldiers trained for war, peasants worked the fields, merchants struggled to trade under the weight of political instability. Edward III would have been acutely aware of these conditions, as a king was responsible not only for maintaining authority, but also for ensuring the welfare of his subjects. The weight of these expectations must have been immense for a teenager, yet it was a burden that shaped his character and his vision for his reign. Life as a young king was also marked by personal and emotional challenges. Edward III had to navigate relationships with his mother, his advisors, his nobles, and his peers, all while cultivating his own identity as a ruler. The isolation of power can be profound, and Edward likely felt the tension between the privileges of his position and the loneliness it entailed. Even simple freedoms, walking in the courtyard unobserved, speaking candidly to friends, making small personal choices, were limited by the ever-present gaze of the court. Yet this environment also fostered resilience, intelligence, and political savvy. Edward III learned to read people, to anticipate motives, and to act with both caution and decisiveness. Despite these pressures, Edward III in a post-life was also filled with moments of wonder, excitement, and discovery. He witnessed tournaments where knights clashed in displays of skill and bravery, and celebrations that showcased music, dance, and elaborate feasts. He observed the rituals of the church, participated in ceremonies that symbolized power and legitimacy, and engaged in the leisure pursuits typical of nobility, from hunting in the forests to practicing falconry. These experiences were not mere entertainment, they were vital lessons in diplomacy, culture, and leadership, teaching Edward about honor, courage, and the spectacle of authority. As Edward matured, the lessons of his youth began to crystallize into a vision for his reign. He understood that to be a king was to combine intellect with strength, diplomacy with decisiveness, and strategy with personal courage. The world he inherited was complex, fraught with danger and opportunity, yet it was a world in which he would make his mark. The early years of his reign, full of observation, learning, and careful maneuvering, laid the foundation for the legendary king he would become. Being King Edward III meant living in a world of contrasts, power and vulnerability, luxury and pressure, ceremony and danger. Every day demanded attention, every action had consequences, and every decision could shift the balance of power. It was a life few could imagine, yet it was one that shaped the course of English history. The young king in Appas' early experiences taught him lessons that would define his leadership: the necessity of courage, the importance of wisdom, the value of loyalty, and the relentless responsibility of wearing a crown. In this world, Edward III was both a boy and a monarch, learning to navigate a realm that demanded more than he could fully comprehend at his age. Yet it was precisely in these early years, amidst the grandeur, danger, and complexity of life at the English court, that Edward began to forge the character of a king who would one day be remembered as one of England and Appas' greatest rulers. To walk in his shoes even for a day is to glimpse the extraordinary pressures and privileges of medieval monarchy, and to understand that the life of a king was never simple, never carefree, and always, unrelentingly, a test of character. In the early years of Edward III and Apas' reign, the young king and Apas' life was defined not by freedom or indulgence, but by a constant struggle for autonomy and survival. At 14, he had inherited a throne still steeped in political turbulence, with his father and Apas' failures leaving a legacy of division, resentment, and suspicion. England was a kingdom fractured by the consequences of weak leadership, and Edward was thrust into this maelstrom while still barely a teenager. It was a time when kingship was not merely a title but an unforgiving test of courage, intelligence, and endurance, and Edward was forced to confront the stark realities of power before he had truly become a man. From the moment he assumed the crown, Edward was under the supervision of his mother, Queen Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer. Isabella, often called the She-Wolf of France and by her critics, was a formidable and ambitious woman who had orchestrated the overthrow of Edward II with Mortimer and Apas' support. Her influence over the young king was pervasive. Mortimer, a shrewd and cunning political operator, acted as her co-regent, wielding power in a way that was both subtle and absolute. For Edward, these were not just authority figures, they were obstacles. He had been crowned king, yet he did not fully command the kingdom. Every decision, every movement, every consultation had to pass under their scrutiny. The court was a theater in which the young king had to play a part, observing, learning, and calculating his next move, all while appearing compliant. The early period of Edward and Apas' rule was one of constrained adolescence, where personal agency was limited and every action bore political weight. He observed his mother and Mortimer with the discerning eyes of a student learning from masters of manipulation and power. Every conversation, every council session, every noble gathering was an opportunity to study human ambition, deceit, and strategy. Edward learned quickly that appearances could be deceiving and that trust was a luxury a king could not afford. Allies could become enemies in an instant, and the slightest misstep might invite rebellion or worse. Life within the castle walls was a constant exercise in observation and restraint. Edward and Apas' days began before dawn and were structured with meticulous precision. Servants attended to his every need, but even routine activities were steeped in ritual. Dressing for the day involved layers of garments, each chosen not only for warmth or comfort, but to convey authority and status. Meals were formal, with the young king surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and family, each aware that even a casual gesture or word might carry meaning beyond its intent. The castle, with its labyrinthine corridors, echoing halls, and towering battlements, was both a home and a court of scrutiny, a space where power was displayed, contested, and maintained at all times. Amidst this atmosphere, Edward began to cultivate his understanding of leadership. He observed the mechanisms of governance, noting how decisions were made, how favors were granted, and how alliances were forged and broken. Mortimer and Isabella represented an almost overwhelming force of authority, yet Edward recognized their vulnerabilities. Mortimer, though intelligent, was ambitious to a fault, often underestimating the subtle power of a king in Apas' presence. Isabella, while shrewd and politically adept, was constrained by her own ambitions and the perceptions of the nobility. Edward saw that to reclaim his authority, he would need not only courage but patience, strategy, and timing. The turning point in Edward and Apas' early reign came in the form of calculated audacity. By the age of 17, he had grown into a young man of remarkable determination and insight. He had absorbed the lessons of his tutors, advisors, and even his adversaries. He understood the importance of seizing opportunity and acting decisively. In 1330, Edward executed a bold plan that would change the course of his reign. In what could only be described as a masterstroke of timing and strategy, he staged a coup against Mortimer, who had long exercised de facto control over the kingdom. Mortimer was arrested, tried, and executed, and Isabella was placed in a position of diminished influence. Edward had finally cast off the shadows of regency and assumed the reins of power in his own right. This was a remarkable achievement for a 17-year-old. It was not simply the removal of Mortimer that marked the momentous nature of Edward and Apas' action. It was the demonstration of his emerging character as a ruler. He exhibited decisiveness, courage, and the ability to orchestrate complex political maneuvers with precision. By reclaiming authority, Edward signaled to the nobility, the clergy, and the common people that he was no longer a passive figurehead but a king capable of leadership, judgment, and action. The act of seizing power from Mortimer was both symbolic and practical. It marked the beginning of a reign in which Edward would not merely inherit power but actively define it. The period following Mortimer and Apos' removal was a time of consolidation and assertion. Edward III began to establish his own court, appointing loyal advisors and building a network of allies among the nobility. He strengthened the administration of the kingdom, overseeing the collection of taxes, the enforcement of law, and the management of England and Apos' defenses. He understood that kingship was not just about martial prowess or ceremony, but about governance, the careful balancing of interests, and the projection of authority across a diverse and often fractious realm. Edward and Apos' assumption of full control of the monarchy also demonstrated a remarkable understanding of psychological power. He knew that a king and Apos' authority was as much about perception as it was about action. He cultivated an image of strength, decisiveness, and fairness. Nobles who might have been tempted to challenge his authority were reminded that the king could act swiftly and decisively. The people of England, witnessing the stability and vigor of his rule, gained confidence in the monarchy once more. Edward understood that legitimacy was not simply inherited, it was earned through the consistent exercise of power and the careful cultivation of respect and loyalty. Yet even as Edward asserted his authority, he was mindful of the delicate web of relationships that sustained the kingdom. England in the early 14th century was a complex tapestry of competing interests. Nobles wielded considerable regional power and could challenge the crown if provoked. The church held moral authority and could influence public perception. Foreign powers watched the kingdom and Apos' internal dynamics, ready to exploit any weakness. Edward and Apos' early experiences with Mortimer and Isabella had taught him that leadership required both strength and diplomacy. To be king was to navigate a world in which alliances were fragile, loyalty was conditional, and every decision had the potential to reverberate across the realm. Edward III and Apos' early struggles also shaped his approach to military leadership. While he was still young, he observed the importance of martial skill, strategy, and personal courage. In the medieval period, a king was expected to lead armies, inspire soldiers, and defend the kingdom against both internal and external threats. Edward understood that authority derived not only from governance, but from the ability to project power on the battlefield. His early exposure to military planning, training, and the realities of conflict instilled in him the confidence and knowledge that would later define his legendary campaigns in France and beyond. At the same time, Edward and Apos' youth and relative inexperience made him vulnerable. The early years of his reign were a crucible, testing his intelligence, resilience, and capacity for judgment. Every misstep could have been fatal, every hesitation exploited by ambitious nobles or foreign adversaries. Yet Edward demonstrated remarkable adaptability. He learned to observe carefully, to weigh risks, and to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. His success in removing Mortimer and reclaiming authority was the result of both preparation and timing, a testament to his emerging mastery of the art of kingship. The psychological pressures of this period cannot be overstated. Edward III was a young man living in a world where power was absolute, yet perilous. The stakes where existential failure could mean loss of the crown, imprisonment, or even death. Every interaction, every decision carried weight far beyond what a modern person might imagine. The constant vigilance required, the awareness of potential betrayal, and the need for strategic foresight would have honed Edward and Apos' intellect, judgment, and resolve in ways that few experiences could match. Despite these pressures, Edward and Apos' early reign was also marked by moments of opportunity, learning, and personal growth. He cultivated relationships with key nobles, observed the intricacies of courtly diplomacy, and gained first-hand experience in the challenges of governance. Each day, each council session, each negotiation was a lesson in the exercise of power, teaching him about loyalty, ambition, human behavior, and the complex interplay of authority and influence. Edward III and Apos' successful seizure of power from Mortimer was more than a personal triumph. It was a transformative moment for the kingdom. It marked the beginning of a reign defined by assertiveness, strategic acumen, and the pursuit of national strength. The young king had demonstrated that he was capable of leadership, that he understood the responsibilities of kingship, and that he could navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics with skill and courage. This achievement would set the tone for the decades to come, establishing Edward as a ruler who combined vision, decisiveness, and a profound understanding of both power and responsibility. By the end of this early period, Edward III had transitioned from a controlled, observed, and constrained teenager to a sovereign in his own right, commanding respect, loyalty, and authority. He had learned that kingship required more than inherited title, it required intelligence, courage, foresight, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. He had begun to forge the character and reputation that would later make him one of England and Epos' most celebrated monarchs. The early struggles, the careful observations, the calculated risks, and the decisive actions all contributed to shaping a king who would leave an indelible mark on the history of England. In these formative years, Edward III proved that even in the face of immense pressure, a young ruler could assert authority, navigate political complexity, and lay the groundwork for a reign of strength and legacy. The lessons he learned during this time, the importance of vigilance, strategy, decisiveness, and perception would guide him through the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead, from military campaigns to domestic governance, from diplomacy to cultural patronage. These early struggles were not merely obstacles, they were the crucible in which the king was forged, preparing Edward III to meet the demands of power with wisdom, courage, and an unwavering sense of purpose. Once Edward III had seized full control of his kingdom, he turned his attention to the broader stage of European politics, where dynastic claims, honor, and ambition interwove in a tapestry of potential glory and devastating conflict. To be king in 14th century England was not merely to govern, it was to embody the nation, to lead armies into battle, and to assert the kingdom and Epos' influence across borders. Edward III, already tempered by the trials of his early years and the overthrow of Mortimer, understood that a king and Epos' authority could not rest solely upon domestic management or ceremonial power. A king and Epos' legitimacy, particularly in this era, was inseparable from military prowess, personal courage, and the capacity to project strength beyond the walls of his own realm. From the outset, Edward and Epos' eyes were drawn to France. The English monarchy had long harbored claims across the Channel, rooted in centuries of intermarriage, inheritance disputes, and shifting alliances. Edward himself had familial ties to the French crown through his mother, Isabella, daughter of the French king Philip IV. When the French king Charles IV died without a male heir, Edward saw an opportunity. The question of succession became a crucible for his ambition. Should the crown of France pass through the female line, Edward and Epos' claim might have been recognized. The French nobility, however, invoked the Salic law, which barred inheritance through women, and instead crowned Philip the Sage, a cousin of the late king. To Edward III, this was not merely a legal argument, it was a slight, a challenge to his authority, and an opportunity to assert England and Epos' prestige and power. The young king began to prepare, both diplomatically and militarily, for the struggle that would erupt into the 100 Years in Epos. War, a conflict that would define his reign and shape the history of Europe. For Edward, war was more than a political tool. It was a proving ground, a stage on which the virtues of kingship, courage, leadership, strategy, and honor could be displayed for all to see. Preparing for war in medieval Europe was an intricate and formidable task. The king was responsible for assembling armies, securing funding, and ensuring that his forces were not only numerous but disciplined and loyal. Edward drew upon the feudal system, summoning his vassals to provide men, horses, and equipment. Nobles were expected to lead contingents from their own lands, and their loyalty was essential to the success of the campaign. Yet relying on the nobility was fraught with risk. Each lord had his own ambitions, grudges, and agendas, and Edward had to maintain their loyalty through a combination of rewards, promises, and demonstration of leadership. Edward and Epos' preparation extended beyond mere logistics. He immersed himself in the study of strategy, drawing upon the lessons of past conflicts and the guidance of experienced commanders. He understood the importance of morale, the psychology of soldiers, and the need for decisive leadership on the battlefield. A king could inspire loyalty and courage simply by his presence, by riding at the forefront of battle, by demonstrating fearlessness and determination. Edward embraced this ideal. He did not view kingship as a passive or distant role. He believed that a king must lead by example, sharing the dangers and hardships of his men. The first major military campaigns of Edward III and Epos' reign would demonstrate this philosophy. In 1337, tensions with France escalated, and Edward began to assert his claim to the French crown openly, initiating a series of campaigns that would continue, intermittently, for over a century. England and Epos' forces, while formidable, were facing a powerful and experienced adversary in France. The challenges were immense. Logistics of moving armies across the Channel, maintaining supply lines, managing alliances with other European powers, and anticipating the movements of a French king equally determined to defend his realm. Every decision was critical, and the stakes could not have been higher. Edward and Apos' approach to warfare reflected both audacity and pragmatism. He recognized the value of tactical innovation, careful planning, and the integration of diverse military forces. England and Apos' army was composed not only of knights and nobles but of archers, infantry, and mercenary contingents, each with distinct capabilities and needs. The famed English longbowmen, with their deadly skill and range, would become a key component of Edward and Apos' military successes. Coordinating such a force required skill, discipline, and foresight. Edward understood that victory depended not merely on numbers but on strategy, morale, and the ability to exploit weaknesses in the enemy and Apos' formations. Perhaps the most striking feature of Edward III and Apos' military leadership was his personal courage and presence on the battlefield. Unlike many rulers who directed campaigns from a distance, Edward often fought alongside his men, sharing their dangers and hardships. To ride at the head of an army, to feel the clash of swords and the thunder of hooves beneath you, was to embody the very ideal of kingship. Soldiers who witnessed their king fighting beside them were inspired, their loyalty strengthened by the knowledge that their sovereign was willing to face the same risks they did. This approach also reinforced Edward and Apos' authority. A king who led by example commanded respect not only from his troops but from his nobility, who recognized in him a blend of courage, intelligence, and strategic acumen. The early battles of the 100 Years and Apos' War showcased Edward and Apos' tactical brilliance. His forces achieved several notable victories, using a combination of disciplined infantry, skilled archers, and decisive cavalry maneuvers to outmatch larger French armies. These victories were not only military successes but political statements. Each triumph reinforced Edward and Apos' claim, enhanced his prestige, and demonstrated to both allies and adversaries that England was led by a king who was courageous, competent, and capable of achieving what others might deem impossible. Yet warfare was not without its complexities and dangers. Campaigns required careful attention to supply lines, the movement of troops, and the management of resources. Disease, attrition, and the unpredictability of medieval logistics could decimate an army as effectively as any enemy. Edward had to navigate these challenges, balancing aggression with caution, ambition with prudence. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of his claim, the security of his kingdom, and the demonstration of his legitimacy as a monarch. The psychological dimension of kingship during war was also crucial. Edward III understood that fear, morale, and perception could determine the outcome of battles and campaigns as much as swords and arrows. He cultivated an image of fearlessness, decisiveness, and divine favor. To the people of England, his army, and the nobility, Edward was not just a king, he was a symbol of national strength, courage, and destiny. This perception was essential for maintaining support at home while projecting power abroad. Beyond the immediate demands of warfare, Edward III and Apos' military campaigns were intertwined with his vision for England and Apos' place in Europe. He was not content with defensive or minor victories, he sought to assert England and Apos' claim, extend influence, and secure a lasting legacy. To be king, he understood, was to think not only of the present but of history, to shape the narrative of the realm, and to secure a place for his nation in the chronicles of Europe. Every battle, every campaign, every negotiation was part of this larger vision. Edward and Apos' campaigns also had profound consequences for the social and political structure of England. The mobilization of armies required cooperation between the crown and the nobility, while victories enhanced the prestige and loyalty of those who supported him. At the same time, prolonged campaigns demanded resources, creating challenges in taxation, administration, and logistics. Edward had to navigate these domestic pressures, balancing the demands of war with the responsibilities of governance. This dual role as both commander and sovereign was perhaps the greatest challenge of kingship, to lead abroad while maintaining stability at home. Despite these challenges, Edward III and Apos' leadership style proved remarkably effective. His combination of personal courage, strategic insight, and political acumen allowed him to achieve victories that would cement his reputation as one of England and Apos' greatest kings. His ability to inspire loyalty, manage complex military operations, and assert his claim in the face of formidable opposition demonstrated a rare blend of qualities, marking him as a ruler capable of navigating the full spectrum of kingship, from the intimate complexities of courtly intrigue to the grand stage of international conflict. Edward and Apos' approach to war also reflected a broader understanding of the cultural and symbolic dimensions of kingship. In medieval Europe, warfare was intertwined with notions of honor, chivalry, and divine favor. A king who demonstrated bravery and success in battle reinforced his legitimacy, both in the eyes of his subjects and in the judgment of God, as understood in the medieval worldview. Edward III embodied these ideals, leading by example, demonstrating skill and valor, and ensuring that his military actions were both effective and symbolically resonant. As the 100 Years and Apos War unfolded, Edward and Apos' reputation grew, both as a military leader and as a monarch capable of asserting his authority decisively. His campaigns demonstrated that kingship required more than inherited title or ceremonial observance. It required courage, intelligence, strategy, and the ability to inspire and lead men under the most challenging conditions. For Edward III, warfare was not merely a means to an end, but an integral expression of what it meant to be king, a fusion of duty, ambition, courage, and vision. Even in moments of adversity, Edward and Apos' leadership remained steadfast. Battles were unpredictable, victories were hard-won, and setbacks were inevitable. Yet he persisted, learning from each engagement, adapting his strategies, and maintaining the loyalty and morale of his forces. His ability to endure the hardships of campaign life, to navigate the uncertainties of war, and to emerge with success and prestige was a testament to both his personal fortitude and his understanding of kingship. Through these early military campaigns, Edward III not only solidified his claim to the French throne, but also transformed the very nature of English kingship. He demonstrated that a monarch could be both ruler and warrior, strategist and diplomat, symbol and agent of action. His reign would become a benchmark for subsequent generations, illustrating the ideal of a king who combined personal courage with political vision, who led by example, and who understood that the responsibilities of power extended far beyond the walls of the palace or the halls of council. To be King Edward III during this period was to live constantly on the knife edge of opportunity and danger. Every battle demanded careful planning, courage, and decisive action. Every campaign tested the limits of endurance, both personal and national. Yet it was in this crucible of conflict that Edward and Apos' character was forged, his authority confirmed, and his legacy begun. The young king, once constrained by regents and political manipulation, now stood as a formidable ruler, commanding armies, asserting claims, and demonstrating the qualities that would secure his place in history as one of England and Apos' greatest kings. Edward III and Apos' campaigns were not merely about conquest, they were about establishing identity, asserting legitimacy, and embodying the ideals of kingship. To lead men into battle, to project power across contested lands, and to inspire loyalty and courage was to define the very essence of rule. In these endeavors, Edward exemplified the highest expectations of monarchy in medieval Europe. Courage, wisdom, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of honor and prestige. Every victory enhanced his reputation, every setback tested his resolve, and every campaign became a testament to his enduring capacity as a leader. Through the lens of history, Edward III and Apos' military leadership reveals a king who was fully engaged in the multifaceted demands of kingship. He understood that to rule effectively, a monarch must navigate politics, diplomacy, strategy, and the human elements of loyalty, fear, and ambition. His campaigns in France were as much about shaping perception, consolidating power, and inspiring his people as they were about territory or wealth. Even the greatest kings, those whose names are remembered in the annals of history, are not immune to the burdens of tragedy, loss, and the weight of human suffering. For Edward III, the years of his reign brought moments of profound sorrow and extraordinary challenges that tested not only his leadership but also his resilience, his capacity for empathy, and his ability to balance the demands of power with the unpredictable forces of fate. Being king in the 14th century was not merely about triumphs and ceremonies. It was also about navigating the devastating realities that no amount of courage or strategy could fully prevent. The glory of conquest was always shadowed by personal grief and national calamity, and Edward III faced both with the steadfastness expected of a monarch, even as he endured the deep human pain that came with such responsibilities. One of the most immediate and personal challenges Edward faced was the fragility of life itself. The medieval period was an era in which mortality was ever present. Illness, disease, and accidents were constant threats, and the lives of even the most privileged were precarious. Edward endured the loss of close family members, including his own children, a grief that no power or wealth could assuage. Each loss reminded him that the crown, while a symbol of immense authority, could not shield him from the vulnerabilities of the human condition. Personal tragedy weighed heavily upon him, influencing his outlook, shaping his character, and reminding him of the delicate balance between duty and human emotion. These personal sorrows were compounded by national crises that tested Edward and Apost's skill as a ruler. Perhaps the most catastrophic of these was the arrival of the Black Death in England, which began its devastating sweep in 1348. The plague, carried by fleas on rats, spread rapidly through towns and countryside alike, killing millions and decimating communities. To rule during such a time was to confront the limits of human power, to witness suffering that no army, strategy, or diplomacy could prevent. Edward III faced the unimaginable challenge of maintaining order, administering aid where possible, and attempting to stabilize a kingdom in the grip of fear and disease. The plague did not respect rank, wealth, or privilege. It struck indiscriminately, claiming nobles and peasants alike. Edward had to make decisions about resources, quarantine measures, and the continuity of governance, all while grappling with the personal despair of seeing his people perish in staggering numbers. The psychological toll of ruling during such catastrophes cannot be overstated. Edward had to maintain the perception of strength and stability while confronting daily reminders of human frailty and the unpredictability of fate. The king and apost's role required him to project confidence and decisiveness, even as the world around him seemed to unravel. Soldiers and nobles looked to him for guidance, clergy sought his support in maintaining religious and social order, and commoners relied upon his leadership for protection and stability. In every decision, Edward had to weigh practical considerations against moral imperatives, balancing the immediate needs of survival with the longer-term interests of the kingdom. Political challenges compounded these difficulties. The English monarchy, while centralized under Edward and Apost's authority, was constantly navigating tensions between the crown and the nobility. Taxes to fund military campaigns, administrative reforms, or relief efforts during the Black Death were often met with resistance. Nobles were quick to assert their privileges, and disputes over land, succession, and influence could escalate into open conflict. Edward III had to maintain the loyalty of his barons through a combination of negotiation, reward, and the careful projection of royal authority. Every misstep could destabilize the realm, yet Edward demonstrated remarkable political acumen, understanding the delicate balance required to maintain cohesion and ensure that the machinery of governance continued to function amidst chaos. One of the most profound tests of Edward and Apost's leadership was the management of succession and family alliances, matters that were never purely personal but always politically charged. The deaths of children, the marriages of heirs, and the fates of extended family members had ramifications for both domestic stability and international relations. The king had to navigate these matters with care, ensuring that dynastic continuity was maintained while also responding to the human dimensions of grief and loyalty. These were not abstract problems, they were deeply personal and intertwined with the practical realities of ruling a kingdom at a time of turbulence and uncertainty. The Black Death, in particular, reshaped the social and economic landscape of England, creating challenges that went far beyond immediate mortality. Labor shortages, disruptions to trade, and the collapse of local economies threatened both the crown and Apost's revenues and the stability of the realm. Edward III had to respond to these challenges with both policy and presence, directing resources where possible, supporting the continuity of agriculture and trade, and reassuring a population confronted with unprecedented mortality. The pressures of governance during such a crisis required resilience, vision, and a capacity to act decisively in circumstances that were often beyond the control of any ruler. Beyond these external challenges, Edward also contended with internal threats to his authority. Even after asserting full control following the overthrow of Mortimer, the political landscape remained perilous. Ambitious nobles, disaffected barons, and rival claimants could exploit moments of weakness, and Edward had to maintain vigilance against plots and insurrection. The memory of his father in a post-deposition was ever present, reminding him that kingship was not guaranteed by birth alone but required constant assertion, strategic action, and an ability to respond to threats both visible and hidden. Edward and Apost's early experiences with regency had instilled in him a keen understanding of the interplay between loyalty, fear, and perception, lessons that were invaluable as he navigated crises and maintained the cohesion of his kingdom. In addition to political and social challenges, Edward faced military pressures that required careful management. While his campaigns in France were successful and often celebrated, they were also fraught with the logistical, strategic, and human difficulties inherent in medieval warfare. Armies could be decimated by disease, mismanagement, or poor planning, and Edward had to balance the demands of military ambition with the realities of limited resources, uncertain loyalty, and the unpredictable nature of conflict. The psychological burden of knowing that the lives of thousands of men rested upon his decisions was immense. Each order, each movement of troops, each engagement in battle carried consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield, affecting families, communities, and the stability of the realm itself. Personal grief intersected with these political and military pressures in ways that shaped Edward and Apos' reign. The loss of children or close relatives was not simply an emotional burden, it had practical ramifications for succession, alliances, and the continuity of governance. Edward had to reconcile his personal sorrow with the demands of public duty, maintaining composure and decisiveness in circumstances that were emotionally wrenching. The human dimension of kingship, the need to govern effectively while enduring personal suffering, was a constant and unrelenting challenge, one that Edward faced with resilience and a sense of moral responsibility. Edward and Apos' responses to these challenges reflected both pragmatism and foresight. He understood that a king and Apos' legitimacy depended not only upon success in war or the administration of justice, but also upon the perception of fairness, compassion, and moral authority. In the face of plague, famine, and personal tragedy, he sought to uphold the institutions of governance, maintain law and order, and support the welfare of his subjects wherever possible. These efforts were both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the image of a king who was both powerful and responsible, capable of guiding his kingdom through adversity, while embodying the moral and ethical standards expected of a ruler. The psychological demands of kingship during periods of tragedy were immense. Edward had to navigate a complex web of human emotion, expectation, and obligation. Nobles, clergy, and commoners each had distinct perspectives and demands, and the king was expected to respond to all. The balance between decisiveness and empathy, between firmness and compassion, was delicate, and Edward and Apos' ability to navigate these demands contributed to his enduring reputation as a wise and capable monarch. Despite the profound challenges of his reign, Edward demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. He managed to maintain stability, project authority, and continue his campaigns abroad even as England grappled with plague, economic disruption, and personal loss. His ability to endure these pressures, to act decisively in the face of uncertainty, and to balance the competing demands of power and compassion reflects the qualities that defined his kingship. Edward and Apos' reign was not one of uninterrupted triumph, it was a testament to the capacity of a ruler to persevere, to learn, and to adapt in response to unprecedented challenges. The weight of these tragedies also shaped Edward and Apos' vision of leadership. He understood that a king and Apos' role extended beyond the immediate exercise of power, it encompassed the moral, cultural, and ethical dimensions of governance. He recognized that leadership required not only action but example, not only authority but responsibility. In responding to crisis, he sought to embody the qualities of courage, resilience, and wisdom that would inspire loyalty and respect among his subjects. The human capacity to endure suffering, to act decisively in the face of uncertainty, and to maintain a sense of purpose amid chaos became central to Edward and Apos' conception of kingship. Edward III and Apos' experience with tragedy and adversity also underscored the interconnection between personal and national destiny. The losses he endured, the crises he managed, and the decisions he made during periods of extreme difficulty were inseparable from the broader trajectory of the kingdom. His capacity to navigate these challenges strengthened the monarchy, solidified his authority, and demonstrated that effective kingship required both courage and moral fortitude. Edward and Apos' reign illustrates that the life of a king was as much a test of character as it was a measure of power, and that enduring greatness often emerges from the crucible of adversity. Even as Edward confronted plague, personal loss, and political turbulence, he remained attentive to the broader needs of his kingdom. The administration of justice, the maintenance of law and order, and the management of resources were ongoing responsibilities that required focus and diligence. Edward and Apos' ability to continue effective governance in the midst of these crises reflects both his intelligence and his commitment to the principles of kingship. He recognized that authority was reinforced not only by displays of power or military success, but also by the capacity to govern wisely, to protect the welfare of subjects, and to uphold the institutions that sustained the realm. Through these experiences, Edward III and Apo's character and leadership were shaped in profound ways. The combination of personal sorrow, national crisis, and political complexity demanded resilience, wisdom, and moral courage. Edward learned that kingship was a constant negotiation between ambition and responsibility, between human vulnerability and the demands of authority. The challenges he faced, the deaths of loved ones, the devastation of the Black Death, and the pressures of maintaining loyalty and stability tested him as a ruler and as a human being, forging a monarch capable of both strategic brilliance and empathetic leadership. As Edward III entered the later years of his reign, the Kingdom of England had been transformed under his rule. His life, once defined by the trials of youth and the struggle to assert authority against formidable adversaries, had matured into a reign marked by both military achievement and cultural sophistication. By the time he approached the final decades of his kingship, Edward and Apo's authority was firmly established, his legacy largely secure, and his influence felt not only across England but throughout Europe. To be King Edward III in these years was to stand as a symbol of continuity, strength, and resilience, a monarch who had endured both the internal and external pressures of rule with remarkable skill and determination. The military campaigns that had defined much of Edward and Apo's reign continued to resonate long after the battles were fought. The victories at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 were more than mere triumphs on the battlefield. They were demonstrations of strategic brilliance, the effective use of innovative tactics, and the assertion of English power against a traditionally dominant France. These battles exemplified Edward and Apo's understanding of warfare as an instrument not only of conquest but of political leverage, prestige, and national identity. The use of the English longbow, disciplined infantry, and carefully coordinated strategies revolutionized medieval combat and secured a lasting place for Edward III in military history. His leadership in these campaigns, often present at the front lines, reinforced the ideal of the king as both warrior and statesman, capable of inspiring loyalty and courage among his soldiers while asserting the legitimacy of his rule. Beyond the battlefield, Edward and Apo's governance had matured into a sophisticated system that balanced authority, administration, and diplomacy. Over decades of rule, he had refined the structures of government, establishing effective channels for taxation, justice, and the management of estates. The crown and Apo's finances, previously strained by the costs of war and the disruption of domestic crises, were stabilized under his oversight. Edward demonstrated a keen understanding of the interdependence between fiscal responsibility and political authority, recognizing that a strong monarchy depended on both the loyalty of the nobility and the well-being of the broader population. He implemented policies that reinforced central authority while allowing for regional autonomy, creating a balance that contributed to stability and continuity across his realm. Edward III and Apo's attention to diplomacy remained a cornerstone of his strategy. His reign was characterized by complex negotiations with neighboring kingdoms, the cultivation of alliances through marriage and treaty, and careful management of international perceptions. The king understood that England and Apo's position in Europe depended not only on military strength but on reputation, alliances, and the credibility of its leadership. He engaged with other monarchs with a keen sense of timing, leverage, and negotiation, often turning crises into opportunities for assertion of influence. Edward and Apo's ability to combine military prowess with diplomatic finesse exemplified the multidimensional nature of effective kingship in medieval Europe. Cultural and ceremonial achievements also defined Edward and Apo's legacy. The Order of the Garter, established decades earlier, continued to symbolize the ideals of chivalry, loyalty, and honor that he had promoted throughout his reign. Tournaments, pageants, and courtly rituals maintained their significance, reinforcing social hierarchies, celebrating martial skill, and providing tangible expressions of the monarchy and Apo's authority. Edward and Apo's patronage of the arts, architecture, and education left an enduring imprint on the cultural landscape of England, demonstrating that the responsibilities of a king extended far beyond the practical administration of power. He understood that the perception of majesty, sophistication, and ethical leadership could strengthen political authority and leave a legacy that would endure long after the king himself had passed from the throne. The domestic policies of Edward III also reflected his attention to the welfare of his subjects and the stability of the realm. He worked to ensure that the rule of law was enforced consistently, that disputes were mediated fairly, and that economic activity was supported even in times of adversity. Following the devastations of the Black Death, which had claimed countless lives and disrupted trade, Edward implemented measures to stabilize agriculture, labor, and commerce. He recognized that a prosperous, orderly, and loyal population was essential to the resilience of the kingdom and the maintenance of monarchical authority. His interventions combined pragmatism with foresight, demonstrating an understanding of governance that was both practical and strategic. Edward and Apos' personal relationships with his family continued to influence his reign. His sons, particularly the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, were trained in the principles of leadership, military strategy, and chivalric conduct, ensuring the continuity of the monarchy and the preparation of the next generation. The education and mentorship he provided to his heirs reflected his understanding that kingship was not solely inherited but cultivated, requiring both moral guidance and practical experience. By investing in the development of his children, Edward sought to secure the future of the crown, maintaining both dynastic stability and the ethical standards of leadership he valued so highly. The king and Apos' later years were also marked by reflection and consolidation. Having navigated decades of warfare, political intrigue, and personal tragedy, Edward III understood the importance of legacy. He sought to ensure that the institutions he had established, the alliances he had forged, and the cultural standards he had promoted would endure beyond his own lifetime. This concern for legacy extended to both tangible achievements, fortifications, palaces, legal reforms, and intangible ones, such as the cultivation of loyalty, honor, and the perception of kingship. Edward and Apos' awareness of the historical record, the judgments of posterity, and the narratives that would shape England and Apos' memory of his reign informed his actions, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the interplay between power, culture, and history. Even as he approached the end of his life, Edward remained engaged with the challenges of kingship. Military campaigns continued, both to assert claims abroad and to maintain security at home. Diplomatic correspondence, negotiations, and treaties occupied his attention. The administration of justice, the oversight of revenue, and the management of estates remained critical responsibilities. Edward understood that the responsibilities of a king were never diminished by age or infirmity. Authority had to be continually exercised, perception maintained, and the machinery of governance attended to. His capacity to remain active and engaged in these matters reflected both personal discipline and a deep sense of duty. Edward III and Apos' final years also allowed him to witness the fruits of his labor. A kingdom more stable, more prestigious, and more cohesive than the one he had inherited as a young, constrained monarch. The nobility was bound by loyalty and shared ideals of chivalry, the administration of government was more effective, and England and Apos' reputation in Europe was enhanced by military success, diplomatic skill, and cultural refinement. Edward could observe that his vision for the monarchy had largely been realized. A king who combined martial prowess with ethical leadership, ceremonial sophistication, and strategic governance. This synthesis of qualities defined his legacy and set a standard for future rulers. The impact of Edward III and Apos' reign extended far beyond his own lifetime. The military innovations he championed, including the effective use of the longbow and disciplined infantry, influenced European warfare for generations. The institutions he established, from centralized administration to the Order of the Garter, created enduring frameworks for governance, loyalty, and cultural identity. The standards of chivalry, honor, and ethical leadership he promoted shaped the expectations of both nobility and monarchy, providing a model that would resonate throughout English history. Edward and Apos' reign demonstrated that a successful king could balance the demands of power with the cultivation of culture, ethics, and perception, leaving a legacy that combined practical authority with enduring symbolic significance. Edward and Apos' life and reign also offer a profound illustration of the human dimensions of kingship. Despite immense power and authority, he faced personal loss, the devastating effects of plague, and the complex challenges of managing a kingdom during turbulent times. His ability to endure, adapt, and continue exercising authority in the face of these challenges underscores the interplay between human resilience and the responsibilities of leadership. Edward and Apos' story is a reminder that kingship is not merely an abstract title or ceremonial role. It is a continuous negotiation between personal capacity, historical circumstance, and the expectations of subjects, allies, and posterity. The enduring fascination with Edward III lies not only in his military achievements or the political stability he secured, but in the way he embodied the ideals of kingship in their fullest sense. He was a warrior, a statesman, a patron of culture, a moral exemplar, and a shaper of history. His reign was a demonstration of how power, when exercised with intelligence, courage, and ethical awareness, could transform both a kingdom and its perception in the wider world. Edward and Apos' accomplishments in war, diplomacy, culture, and governance were intertwined, each reinforcing the other, creating a holistic vision of kingship that combined tangible achievements with symbolic resonance. Even in death, Edward III and Apos' influence persisted. His descendants inherited not only the throne but also the institutions, alliances, and cultural standards he had cultivated. The narrative of his reign, celebrated by chroniclers, artists, and historians, reinforced the memory of a king who had combined ambition with wisdom, courage with prudence, and authority with ethical leadership. The legacy of Edward III shaped both the political and cultural landscape of England for generations, providing a benchmark for the exercise of monarchical power and the integration of military, diplomatic, and cultural leadership. Ultimately, the reign of Edward III exemplifies the profound responsibilities, challenges, and opportunities of medieval kingship. To be a king was to confront danger, uncertainty, and loss while maintaining authority, projecting power, and shaping the identity of the realm. Edward navigated decades of warfare, political intrigue, personal tragedy, and social upheaval, demonstrating resilience, intelligence, and vision at every turn. His reign offers a comprehensive portrait of effective leadership, illustrating the integration of military strategy, governance, diplomacy, culture, and ethical responsibility in a single enduring example of monarchical excellence. The legacy of Edward III is therefore multidimensional. He is remembered not only as a conqueror and strategist but as a patron of culture, a promoter of chivalric ideals, a skilled diplomat, and a ruler who understood the intricate balance between authority and responsibility. His reign provides a case study in the exercise of power, the cultivation of loyalty, and the management of both triumph and tragedy. By the time of his death, England had been shaped by his vision, strengthened by his leadership, and imbued with the ideals of honor, courage, and sophistication that he championed. Edward III and Apos' life story, from a young king constrained by regents to a mature monarch whose authority was absolute and respected, is a testament to the resilience, intelligence, and foresight required to rule effectively. It demonstrates how personal courage, strategic acumen, cultural cultivation, and ethical leadership can intersect to produce a reign that endures in history. His reign, characterized by both remarkable achievements and profound challenges, stands as one of the most compelling examples of medieval kingship, illustrating the enduring interplay between power, responsibility, and legacy. In the years that followed the height of his reign, the world that Edward III had shaped began to change in ways both subtle and profound. Time, which no king could command, gradually shifted the balance from conquest to preservation, from expansion to reflection. The great warrior king who had once ridden at the head of armies now found himself presiding over a realm that required careful stewardship more than bold campaigns. The clang of armor and the thunder of cavalry, though still present in memory and ceremony, gave way increasingly to the quieter but no less demanding responsibilities of governance, diplomacy, and legacy. Age brought with it not only physical limitations but also a broader perspective. Edward had lived long enough to see the consequences of decisions made decades earlier. Lands won in triumph required administration. Alliances forged in urgency demanded maintenance. Laws enacted to solve immediate crises became the foundations of long-term order. The king in Apos' daily life became a constant balancing act between honoring the martial identity that had defined his earlier reign and adapting to the evolving needs of a kingdom entering a new era. The England of his later years was not the England he had inherited. It was more confident in its identity, more experienced in the machinery of centralized rule, and more conscious of its place within the wider political landscape of Europe. War had elevated national pride, but it had also imposed economic and social strain. The crown needed revenue to sustain its ambitions, yet taxation required negotiation with nobles and representatives of towns and shires. This ongoing dialogue between monarch and realm gradually strengthened the institutional character of government, creating expectations of consultation and shared responsibility that would shape the future of the kingdom. Edward, whether intentionally or not, became a participant in this transformation from a purely feudal model of kingship to something more structured and administrative. Royal authority still radiated from the person of the king, but it was increasingly expressed through councils, courts, and officials whose roles extended beyond individual campaigns or personal loyalty. The bureaucracy that developed under his reign allowed the kingdom to function even when the monarch was absent or infirm, a sign that England was evolving into a more durable political entity. At court, ceremony retained enormous importance. Rituals reaffirmed continuity at a time when uncertainty lingered beneath the surface. Feasts, religious observances, and gatherings of the nobility reinforced the bonds that held the social order together. These events were not mere displays of luxury, they were instruments of governance, carefully choreographed to remind all who attended that stability flowed from the crown. Edward understood the symbolic power of such occasions. Even when he no longer led troops into battle, his presence in these rituals projected authority and reassured the kingdom that its guiding figure remained steadfast. Yet beneath the splendor, challenges persisted. The long conflict with France had not ended decisively, and maintaining overseas claims required constant attention. Garrisons needed supplies, commanders required direction, and negotiations ebbed and flowed with the tides of fortune. The dream of permanent dominance across the Channel proved elusive, as warfare drained resources and shifting alliances complicated strategy. Edward and Apos' later years were therefore marked less by dramatic victories, and more by endurance and ongoing effort to hold together what had already been gained. Economic realities also pressed upon the kingdom. The demographic upheaval caused by the plague had permanently altered the relationship between labor and land. Workers, fewer in number, could demand better conditions, while landowners struggled to maintain productivity. Laws attempting to regulate wages and movement reflected the crown and Apos' effort to preserve order in a society adjusting to new circumstances. Edward and Apos' government sought to mediate these tensions, aware that unrest among the population could threaten the stability for which so much had been sacrificed. For the king personally, these years invited contemplation. He had outlived many contemporaries, including trusted companions of earlier campaigns. The generation that had fought beside him was fading, replaced by younger men whose memories of war were inherited rather than lived. This generational shift subtly altered the atmosphere of court. Traditions established during Edward and Apos' rise were now treated as established custom, no longer innovations but expectations. The king and Apos' relationship with his heirs became increasingly central. Preparing the next rulers of England required more than granting titles, it demanded transmitting an understanding of kingship shaped by decades of experience. Edward emphasized not only martial skill but also judgment, patience, and awareness of the burdens that accompanied the crown. He had learned that authority must be sustained through wisdom as much as force, and he sought to ensure that this lesson endured. Religion played an equally significant role in these final chapters. Medieval kingship was inseparable from spiritual responsibility, and Edward devoted attention to acts of piety, patronage of religious institutions, and the observance of sacred traditions. Such actions reflected genuine belief, but also reinforced the perception that the monarchy operated within a divine framework. In a time when uncertainty often seemed overwhelming, faith offered both personal solace and political legitimacy. As Edward aged, the mythology of his own reign began to take shape even before his death. Chroniclers recorded his victories, poets celebrated his chivalry, and stories circulated that elevated his deeds into legend. The king who had once struggled to assert control over his own throne was now depicted as the embodiment of ideal kingship. This emerging narrative served an important purpose. It unified the realm around a shared memory of greatness, strengthening loyalty not only to Edward himself but to the institution of monarchy. Still, the human dimension of his life remained ever present. Physical decline reminded all at court that even the most powerful ruler could not escape time. The routines of governance increasingly passed to trusted advisors and family members, though always in the king and Apos' name. Edward and Apos' authority persisted, but it was exercised through networks of delegation that ensured continuity while acknowledging reality. The atmosphere of the kingdom during these years was therefore one of transition. England stood between eras, no longer the embattled realm of Edward and Apos' youth, not yet the nation that future generations would inherit. The structures he had built were being tested by longevity rather than crisis, by the need to function without constant personal intervention from the monarch who had created them. International observers watched this period closely. Allies and rivals alike assessed whether England and Apos' strength would endure beyond the lifetime of the king who had driven its expansion. Diplomatic exchanges carried an undercurrent of calculation, as foreign courts considered how succession might alter the balance of power. Edward, aware of these perceptions, worked to present an image of continuity and preparedness, signaling that the kingdom he led was larger than any single individual. Within England, memory of past triumphs remained a unifying force. Veterans recounted campaigns to younger listeners, reinforcing ideals of courage and loyalty. The culture of chivalry that Edward had promoted continued to shape noble identity, influencing everything from training and education to expectations of conduct. Though warfare itself evolved, the values associated with Edward and a post-era retained their prestige. In quieter moments, the king could look upon the tangible results of his long reign. Fortified towns, expanded trade networks, administrative records, and institutions capable of managing a complex society. These were not as dramatic as battlefield victories, yet they represented a deeper achievement: the creation of resilience. Edward had not merely fought wars, he had helped construct a framework within which England could survive future challenges. The final phase of his life thus carried a sense of culmination rather than conclusion. Responsibilities did not cease, but they were accompanied by recognition that his influence would outlive him. Decisions were made with an eye toward durability, ensuring that policies and precedents could guide successors who would face circumstances he could not foresee. When Edward III eventually passed from the scene, he left behind more than memories of conquest. He left a kingdom accustomed to thinking of itself as unified under strong leadership, a political culture that blended martial tradition with administrative order, and a legacy of ambition tempered by experience. The story of his reign did not end with his death. It continued in the institutions he shaped, the expectations he established, and the historical imagination he inspired. Later generations would debate his successes and failures, as historians often do, but none could deny the magnitude of his impact. He had redefined what it meant to rule England during a time of extraordinary upheaval.